I guess a little bit about me, a little context. My story is I am a lifelong filmmaker. I've been making movies for as long as I can possibly remember. In fact, I don't remember a time in my life when I didn't want to make movies in some way, shape, or form. And my initial draw to filmmaking was animation, special effects, and puppetry. So when I was a kid, I either wanted to be a traditional animator for Disney, build models for Industrial Light and Magic, or make puppets for Jim Henson. That was the dream. The more I threw myself into those endeavors, the more I realized that, well, to quote George Lucas once said that a special effect without a story is a very boring thing. And I discovered that to be true very quickly. That I can create cool-looking imagery, but if there isn't some, character-driven, heartfelt story behind that effect, the effect actually isn't all that impressive. So I threw myself into the study of story and really became a deep student of story probably about 15 years ago. And a lot of my story is that I tell people that I had to write poorly for about 10 years before I finally said, you know what, maybe I should take a moment and go back and learn some basics. And then learning the basics turned into, learning a little bit more in depth things about story. And then it finally blossomed into this really hardcore deep dive into the psychology of characters and the importance and relevance that story serves in our lives, in our community, and our society. And so really telling stories that change lives and affect people has become something I love to do, and then also teaching other writers how to do that. So that's where my love for story came from. I've written and directed a feature film, made more short films than I can count, recently completed an animated short film. So that's a little context, for me. I've also taught screenwriting and storytelling for 13 years now here in Los Angeles at a film school. Traveled the world teaching film and primarily storytelling. So story is my passion, and writing is my passion, and that's what I love to talk about. So that's a little bit about me in a nutshell. When I first started studying story, like I said, I did so just to become a better writer. It was more about how do I write a screenplay that sells? That's the only reason I started studying story. I knew my technique just needed a lot of work. And so I started learning the basics that a lot of writers learn, basics like 3-act structure, learning about archetypes and just different story tropes that are good and every writer needs to learn, and it's a great place to start. But it very quickly began to morph into something else for me. I had to learn the basics, and then I had to get frustrated and angry at the basics. And I had to wrestle with the basics. And then once I pushed through my frustration with this sort of formulaic way of telling story, I began to understand a little bit more of the deeper, profound impacts and reasons for story. And I started seeing story playing out in my life every single day, to the point where I started to realize that story, narrative, is actually the tool that the human mind uses to make sense of reality. It's literally what we do to make sense of the world around us. We are cause and effect creatures. When we see something happening in the world, unlike my dog or just some animal out there in the wilderness, when something happens that impacts me in some way, my first reaction is to go, well, what caused this? Where did this come from? And what that is that's my brain searching for the story, searching for the narrative. And what I've learned is we as humans are very uncomfortable when we don't have narrative. We don't sit well in confusion. Even to the point where if I'm driving to work and I get a flat tire on the way to work, there's still a part of my brain that wants to think that flat tire happened for a reason. Now, whether it did or not, that's beyond my understanding, but my mind wants to think that, okay, this pain I'm experiencing right now, this flat tire, maybe it prevented me from having a worse accident down the road. And when we think like that, that's me looking for story. So story is literally what helps us make sense of the world around us. And I see story unfolding all the time. The more I studied story and the more I started getting into the depths of story, I began realizing that story it truly is the language of the human mind. It's the process that a character goes on in a story to solve a problem, like when they're looking for the buried treasure or whatever it is, and all the hurdles that they have to overcome in order to achieve the goal of the story. That's really the same process that my brain goes through when I'm solving even a tiny problem. I go through a 3-act structure when I'm trying to figure out my day-to-day life. I also understood that a lot of the deeper components of story, or some of the surface level components of story, things like conflict in story. Every good story needs conflict. And where does conflict come from? The more I studied these things, I began realizing that this conflict actually is representative of something much deeper. We don't put conflict in a story just to make the story interesting. Conflict is intentionally woven into a story to help a character grow. And when I began to realize that that is what conflict in my own life has the potential to do, that conflict, though it may seem random, or it may even be random, every bit of conflict I experience in my own life, just like conflict in a story, is an opportunity for me to grow. And it took the study of story for me to realize that in my own life. So yeah, just what started with, I just need to learn story so I can sell a screenplay, turned into a study of something that ended up changing my life. So. I don't think that there's a filmmaker of my generation who wouldn't cite Steven Spielberg as an incredible inspiration. And I know that may seem like a really cliche answer, Steven Spielberg, I love Steven Spielberg, but Steven Spielberg raised me. I mean, I'm a child of the 80s, and, his films got me through a lot. And not even as a kid, even into my adult. I'm sitting here drinking my coffee out of my Jurassic Park mug. I mean, Steven Spielberg has had a profound impact on my life. And his sensibilities, his ability to... Steven Spielberg doesn't just make cool movies. He makes cool movies that are tapping into what we call the zeitgeist of the age. He just has this understanding of what's underneath the surface of life in that moment of history. And then he's able to make a film, he's able to grasp onto that and then incorporate that into his filmmaking. So Steven Spielberg's films have just had this unbelievable way of being so relevant when they come out, and then at the same time remain timeless. I don't know how he does it. It's amazing. So I've just been a big fan of his. But other filmmakers that I just really admire in terms of their execution of story, Alfred Hitchcock is one of my favorite directors of all time. Hitch did not write his work, so all of his films were written by other screenwriters, but that doesn't mean Hitchcock wasn't a storyteller. He took those words and incorporated and executed them into masterful films. He was very involved in the story development process, but his story sensibilities and his ability to recognize good stories has always had a big impact on me. My favorite Hitchcock film of all time is Rear Window. Really, any of the Jimmy Stewart, Alfred Hitchcock films I love, but I love Rear Window so much. I grew up watching that film my whole life. In fact, I've probably seen that film more times than I would care to admit. But that was the film that I had a breakthrough moment watching that film. So I started watching the film when I was little. We watch it as a family. And all it was a murder mystery. It was just this guy who was, laid up in a wheelchair with a broken leg, and he thinks he observes or he thinks a murder has taken place, on the other side of the apartment complex. And so it's just kind of him sitting in his wheelchair trying to solve the mystery, looking out of his window with his binoculars. It's just interesting. It's visually compelling and fun. And it wasn't until I was maybe, 15 or 16 years old, and I was watching that film for probably for the 100th time. And all of a sudden it dawned on me. I was like, you know what? This movie is not about a murder. This movie is about the relationship between Grace Kelly and Jimmy Stewart's character. That's what this is about. And I started realizing how little of the dialogue was actually about the murder and how most of it was about their relationship. But yet, as a casual observer, I wouldn't have said that about that movie. I wouldn't have said, "Oh, that's a story about, sort of the societal differences in the '50s between men and women, and gender roles, and relationships and expectations, and all that." I wouldn't have said that at all. I would have said it was about murder. So that film was the first film that I had kind of a big awakening moment where I realized, what drives good storytelling is characters, really compelling characters. So Rear Window is the story about the relationship between two people who, oh, by the way, are solving a murder while they're trying to figure out the relationship. So I always love those stories that are deeply internally driven, regardless of what the plot is. One of my favorite films of all time is the movie Contact, which was directed by Robert Zemeckis, based on Carl Sagan's novel of the same name. And Jodie Foster's the main character in the story. And it's a story about, us receiving a radio signal from space from aliens and humanity's endeavor to try to make contact with the aliens. And so it's a sci-fi film, but it's so character-driven. It's so much about Jodie Foster's character and her growth and what she has to learn and overcome in her life. The movie Silence of the Lambs, another Jodie Foster film, one of my favorite films of all time. I think it's one of the most beautiful examples of a horror drama film with what we call a negatively ironic ending. And negative endings are really hard to pull off in stories. And a negatively ironic ending is an ending where a character accomplishes the goal that they attempted to accomplish in the story, but they didn't change on the inside. Very hard structurally type of story to tell. But that film just did it masterfully. So to watch this creepy horror film, but then watch this character go on this deep, complicated psychological journey was very inspiring to me. It was directed by Jonathan Demme, the late Jonathan Demme. So it's just a really beautiful film. So yeah, in terms of living mentors that I get to sit down and have coffee with, I wish I had more. But it's usually these filmmakers, present filmmakers from the past, that I just recognize their ability to do things masterfully that really have inspired and motivated me.